We have universities, corporations, government agencies, and private sector councils and chambers as members. Today, we have a footprint in 30 countries. This is our Frame the Future conversation series, our fourth session. We started in June. We'll progress this until December when we're having the GFCC 2021 Global Innovation Summit. So just to get us started here, let me share three things with you. One, what this is about. What's the Frame the Future conversation series? The second, I want to introduce you to the conversation today. And finally, I want to talk about logistics. We launched the Frame the Future series, having in mind 5 future-defining topics: innovation, sustainability, resilience, inclusiveness, and partnership. Those are design criteria that we are considering to have a look at competitiveness, strategies, policies, and initiatives. So a big question for the whole series is how we can weave those elements into strategies and initiatives related to future growth, innovation, competitiveness. Our session today is about intellectual property. We have an amazing group of people coming from different continents and countries and bringing different perspectives to this conversation. One question is, hey, how IP systems can help us to drive those elements: innovation, sustainability, resilience, inclusiveness. But also, we know that the landscape is changing. More and more, we have a data-rich world. We have data playing a fundamental part of creation. And we have new processes to engage people in creation efforts: co-design, collaborative creation. So how are those elements coalescing and shaping the future of IP systems? How can we think about revamping and designing future IP systems to boost what we want to do in terms of growth, resilience, innovation, and sustainability? Please join the conversation. This session is also being broadcasted live on YouTube, but here you can use the chat function to share thoughts, to share resources. We'll share some of the things here, including the situation paper that we have created for this conversation. And you can share questions. This will be a lively conversation. We want you to be part of that conversation. To get us started, I want to invite my colleague and friend, Chad Evans, that will really help us to frame the conversation, to get us started, and welcome this amazing group of leaders that we have joining us today. Chad, it's amazing to work with you and to have you here.
Thanks, Roberto. And I also want to extend my welcome to everyone for our third webinar in a series of global conversations on the future economy presented by the GFCC, and in this particular case, sponsored by our longstanding member, Lockheed Martin. You know, Frame the Future is the next step in the GFCC's programming carried out during the past year, serving as a real-time global platform for GFCC member nations to begin co-creating new strategies for a post-pandemic economy. And so over the next crucial 6 months, our Frame the Future conversation is focusing on those 5 future-defining dimensions that we saw in the opening video: innovation, resilience, partnership, inclusiveness, and of course, sustainability. And just as important, how we integrate these concepts into new strategies and programs for sustainable economic growth and inclusive prosperity. You know, our goal is to develop a new set of global competitiveness principles to guide nations as they frame their own future. So today, as Roberto has mentioned, we'll be examining those 5 future-defining dimensions of competitiveness through the lens of IP, intellectual property. IP is the foundation to economies built on knowledge, technology, and innovation. It underpins growth industries around the world, such as microelectronics, software, and biotech. And the IP that's created in those growth industries and new technology-based industries contributes to the growth and competitiveness of a much wider range of other industries across our economies. As the video also showed, IP underpins the value of world-leading companies. You know, 35 years ago, 80% of the market value of the S&P 500 was represented by tangible assets: brick, mortar, equipment, inventory. We've completely flipped that dynamic. Today, nearly 90% of that value is represented by intangible assets. What do we mean by that? We mean patents, trademarks, brands, research, software, the key IP assets, and the raw materials for future value creation. IP protection, as we'll hear from our incredible panel, provides the incentives for creators, inventors, innovators, and businesses to benefit financially from their work and their creativity. And that protection is essential to attract and then to allocate capital that is needed to invest in order to capture the full value of that intellectual property. So IP and its protection are ever more important in an era in which global competitive advantage is based on the generation, the control, and the use and dissemination of knowledge and new technology. However, as Roberto hinted, the IP landscape is becoming more and more dynamic and complex. Here are just a few examples of that complexity. Let's take a look at the microelectronics industry, where product life cycles have essentially collapsed. This industry requires speed and shorter term protection before products are commoditized and before it turns to its next generation of technology. On the other hand, we have industries like pharmaceuticals and biotechnology, which need longer term protection to recover the billions that they have invested in research and development, clinical trials, long-term studies, regulatory approvals, and of course, the inevitable project failures. Second, securing patent protection is complex and costly, and it's a process that, frankly, only large firms might be financially equipped to handle. And on the flip side, smaller firms, startups without such resources tend to seek protection for trade secrets, frankly, because it's simpler and perhaps cheaper. We also see that some entrepreneurs, small firms, and startups secure IP protections to attract financing for a stronger position when seeking out joint ventures, while others don't even intend to commercialize their innovations, but rather they seek IP protection for a stronger negotiating position to attract potential suitors for an acquisition or a licensing agreement. And of course, firms also use patents at times to keep competitors at bay. So, different forms of IP protection may be important at different stages of the innovation life cycle. IP has also become a major target for physical and cyber-enabled industrial espionage and theft. That threat environment continues to grow. Collectors are especially interested in IP in the form of technologies that are increasingly vital to competitiveness, growth, and future industries such as IT, clean tech, nanotechnology. The list goes on. And of course, as we'll also hear, I think, from our panelists, different countries and cultures have different ideas about IP rights, with various viewpoints around what can be protected, as well as different perspectives on the balance between what should be free to society and what can be sold by the private sector. So as we look towards the future, we see at least 5 new IP challenges that are on the horizon as we've entered the 3rd decade of the 21st century. You know, in the past, we have tended to focus on IP theft from companies, and laws have been developed and that focus on that sort of threat. But now we're beginning to see incursions into the academic research enterprise. All around the world, competitiveness strategies increasingly incorporate new R&D investments in the academic sector. Second big trend, the use of crowdsourcing and open innovation platforms means that many creators and inventors could contribute to the development of a potentially valuable technology or a brilliant solution. But in the end, who owns that ultimate IP? Moreover, some of those contributors could be from different countries which have different laws, different practices, different IP views and culture. In addition, scaling a new technology or a solution from IP, say in the manufacturing sector, that requires investment. Now, who's going to make that sort of massive investment without control over the IP? Third trend, emerging technologies such as gene editing and synthetic biology have the potential to create new types of potentially valuable IP. A new gene sequence, chimeras, the list also goes on and on. And as we enter an era of intelligent systems and machine learning, as the video hinted at, we have the potential for machines making new machines, creating new inventions. Who owns the IP in that case? And finally, there is IP at the nexus of resilience and sustainability. There are dire global needs for new innovations and solutions to solve global grand challenges such as adequate food and clean water, health and sustainable energy. The issue of need versus IP ownership has been the source of recent debate over the COVID vaccines that are badly needed around the world. So where is the balance between faster, more widespread distribution of new knowledge and technology that are needed to solve some of these global grand challenges, and the incentives of IP protection that the private sector needs to advance the technology? So there's a lot to talk about, there's a lot to unpack here, and we're fortunate to have an exceptional range of panelists to address IP and competitiveness. We have Christopher Geiger, Enterprise Risk and Sustainability Director at Lockheed Martin, a global company with a legendary technology capability profile and deep and expansive portfolio. In the last decade alone, Lockheed Martin has been awarded more than 2,900 patents. Chris in the firm leads enterprise risk management and sustainability program strategy. He directs Lockheed Martin's business risk assessments and understands the risk to IP, for example, IP threat or cyber threat, and the risk that companies must mitigate, such as environmental risk, with solutions that address sustainability. We also have Claudio Furtado, the president of Brazil's National Institute of Industrial Property. INPE is the government body responsible for administering industrial property rights across Brazil, such as patent grants, tech transfer, and the registration of trademarks, industrial design, software, integrated circuit topography. But his stellar career, his experience, his authorship and expertise goes far beyond these issues, and they span everything from investment strategy to private equity and venture capital. And Claudio, it's great to have you with us. We're very honored. We also have with us today Noam Shemtov. Noam is the deputy head of the Center for Commercial Law Studies at Queen Mary University in London. He is a reader, a principal lecturer in intellectual property and technology law with an emphasis on IP, creative industries, and technology. He has recently led a project on the establishment and operation of a specialized IP court in the Ukraine. He's also worked on the legal dimensions, such as copyright and trademarks, of unusual creative industry intellectual property, such as textile patterns that were translated from sound and music. We have Dr. Paul Robin, Associate Vice Chancellor, the Office of Innovation and Commercialization at the University of California, San Diego. Paul is working to transform the functions of the Tech Transfer Office, Industry Research Alliances, and industry contracting into an integrated organization that includes patenting, strategic corporate research partnering, and industry contracts. He understands the thorny issues that may arise with intellectual property and business academic research partnerships and the spin out of commercialization of university research and inventions. And Gulay Oskan, the design lead for EU Mature Life and the founder of the design consultancy GEDS, is also joining us. She is an award-winning entrepreneur focusing on creating sustainable, scalable solutions to a variety of challenges facing humankind. She's been an advisor to a diverse range of organizations, including South by Southwest. Gulay is one of Fast Company's top 100 female founders in Turkey. She's a winner of Microsoft's 2020 Woman Leader Making a Difference with New Technologies Award. And she's a visiting lecturer at ASEC Business School in Paris. And of course, we have Roberto Alvarez, the executive director of the GFCC, to whom I will now turn to lead our discussion.
Chad, thank you so much. This was a blast, and we have this amazing group of people here today. If you are joining the session now, please join the conversation. You can share a question, use the Q&A feature here to engage in the conversation. What we'll do now, we'll have like an initial round with all our speakers here today. And I really wanted to start with you, Chris. And by doing that, I also want to thank you because of the inspiration that you provided to this session, Chris. Not just Lockheed Martin as a partner, but your comments and insights on data were fundamental for us to curate the session. So I really want to turn to you, Chris, for your reflections on the future of intellectual property and some of the issues that we're seeing.
Well, thank you, Chad and Roberto. It's wonderful to be here to talk about the future of IP systems and the relationship to innovation. At Lockheed Martin, intellectual property is actually one of our sustainability core issues. It falls under a priority area we call elevating digital responsibility, along with data privacy and protection and ethical AI principles. These may not sound like the usual environmental or social topics that are generally associated with sustainability. However, the creation and stewardship of data and IP can be a crucial factor in a sustainable world. Our practical implementation of treating data and IP as a sustainability issue includes data governance and stewardship programs and company-wide education programs. I trust we'll also talk today about how the circular economy can benefit by a collaborative attitude towards IP. IP systems rightfully protect the value of useful invention, but shouldn't be used to preclude any possibility of recycling or reuse. There's also more room for partnership using open standards in a digital development and sustainment environment. Lockheed Martin uses digital thread and digital twin technologies across the total system lifecycle for design, modeling, testing, and maintenance. Rapid innovation is fostered by the open sharing of interfaces to the benefit of users. There's really so much to talk about because IP isn't constrained in the same way that other resources are. So it makes sense that as we move toward a more sustainable and circular economy, we rely more and more on this unlimited resource. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Chris. I found fascinating this notion that IP is not constrained. So it's a world of abundance. I want to leave this idea here for let's say for you to further develop when we come back. Noah, I want to turn to you when Chad was introducing you, was mentioning a variety of things that you were doing, I would say at the frontier of IP. So I see this like double deep challenge about improving systems and setting up like IP systems around the globe, like you have been doing, but also thinking about what's next in terms of frameworks, data, new ways of creating things using algorithms or AI. So what are your initial comments, Noah?
All right, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chad, Roberto, and GFCC for the invitation. I'm looking forward to this, what appears to be building up as a very interesting discussion. And I'll make an observation on, because there are a number of interesting themes that you have identified. I'll start with the area where I've been working the most lately, and that's the artificial intelligence and IP, and in particular, the area in relation to patent law. Now, AI is becoming more prevalent in more and more industries. I mean, some of these sectors are of extreme importance to society. I mean, take, for example, drug discovery, right? This is related to global health, access to medicine. By the way, an area where we in Queen Mary do quite a lot of work within our Global Policy Institute, or GPI. Now, the key questions, there's been a lot of discussion lately in relation to AI and IP. And the key question that I hope we can visit later on is whether AI can be reduced into whether AI is a tool, albeit a sophisticated one, or is it something more than a tool, an autonomous, creative, inventive platform or application that generates things like art and music, right, which are copyrightable subject matter, or patentable subject matter, such as new drugs. Now, if it is indeed a tool, it is, and it can be accommodated within our present IP systems, and it will require probably some adjustments. Well, if it is the latter, it would probably require us to reevaluate our IP mechanisms, maybe even more broadly, evaluate our relationship with technology as human beings and consider issues such as, and there have been discussions both in academic circles but outside academic circles, in relation to notions such as electronic personhood. Right? So we have natural persons like ourselves, corporate persons. There have been various peoples and bodies that were advocating the creation of a new status of that nature. Now, I mean, personally, and we get into that hopefully in a bit, although as a teenager I was an avid reader of Isaac Asimov, right, the 3 laws of robotics. I'm afraid that for now, at least, I sit firmly on the side of science rather than science fiction, and from that you can probably understand that yeah, AI is I would go with AI being a tool. I'll explain more about that later on. But yeah, that's it for now.
So there's a fundamental, let's say, question that we will need to address, and maybe that the answer to that question will change, right? Whether AI is a tool or it's a person, yeah, and or is an entity.
Indeed, and one of the things that Chris mentioned, the role that data plays in that is phenomenal. Data is the oil that lubricates AI systems and applications. So it gives rise to some really interesting questions.
Wonderful, thank you so much, Noam. Gulay, I'm sure you bring a different perspective to this, because what you are doing is you've been managing and leading co-creation efforts involving lots of people across nations, right? So this other perspective that Chad also mentioned in the beginning, co-creation, collaborative design, open platforms, how do you see the things that you are doing being connected to this whole nexus about the future intellectual property and creation?
Okay, the short answer, currently there's no connection. Currently, the creative people are not really part of these conversations in general. So I'm very thanks to you for inviting me, because normally the creative people are not really part of this type of conversations. So I'm founder of a strategic design consultancy. Maybe I should a little bit mention about strategic design, because we are familiar with more product design, graphic design. And in the graphic design, product design world, it was mostly driven by the star designers, whereas strategic design, where you use design and design thinking to create strategic impact. With the strategic design, you can design policies, you can design services, you can design IP intellectual systems, you can design almost anything, and you can really create some strong impact. Even the governments like UK, Estonia, Finland, even it's the part of their government strategy to boost their economy. So, of course, from IP systems perspective, when there are many parties are involved, then things become quite more complicated. I mean, to give a specific example, just last 3.5 years, we have been managing a very large-scale technology project where we aim to design smart products for older people. This project ended in May 2021, just 2 months ago. It was funded by European Commission with €6 million budget, and there were, we were 20 organizations from 9 countries, and then we aimed to design a smart footwear, smart clothing, and smart sofa for older people. But the beauty of the project was mainly come from that we involved older people also be part of the design process. So I can give more details about our design process, but because the way that we managed the whole design process was we de-emphasize the designers and almost involve everyone in the process. Of course, the product that we developed from IP perspective, it's the, IP systems, or in general, intellectual property mainly focus on the tangible products, and mostly this is defined by technology. So when we come to the end, to discuss about the IP rights, I can say that creative people, even the IP systems, the questionnaires, the structure, everything's from technology perspective, from product-driven perspective. So that's why it's not really super possible right now to cover creative people's intangible work. But the thing is, just with technology, almost around 90% or 3 out of 4 startups fails, mainly because they don't address any needs or market. But this is very exactly creative people, enter the picture and then define the needs. So we need creative people in these discussions, and also design itself can be a good tool to design the whole intellectual property systems. So maybe this would be a brief intro from my perspective.
Thank you, Gulay. So I think that you highlighted a fundamental gap that you have, that is to connect technology with creativity, with, let's say, people who are imagining creating the future. So thanks for highlighting that and for being here, and especially for accepting the invitation in a very short notice. So this is very.
It's a very surprising for me that a creative person is part of such conversation. So thanks very much.
Yeah. And one thing that I want to leave here, maybe for us to explore, is how do you see this, the thing that you mentioned? So you had people in 9 countries. You had users being part of the creation process, right? So I want to maybe in our next round explore how you do that and how do you see this process evolving, right?
Sure.
This type of thing. Yeah. But Paul, thank you for being here early morning in California, super early, 6:30 a.m. Great to have you here. You've been driving the translation of creation and knowledge and IP into economic value for one of the main research universities in the globe. And doing that, engaging with your internal network and your external network of partners. So what's your take on this transformation that's happening coming from data, from new creative process or IP generation process? How is that affecting what you do, and what are some of the prospects related to that?
Sure, yeah. Thank you, Roberto and Chad. It's a pleasure to be here, so thank you for the invitation. Yeah, so my job basically at the university is to help to enact the Chancellor's Economic Development Policy, right, which is to drive social and economic prosperity in our region and beyond. And that really is the fundamental driver, is how do we make people's lives better? With all of the output of our considerable research portfolio, which is about $1.5 billion a year. So it's one of the largest academic research portfolios in the country. IP is a huge part of that, of course, but IP to me is just a tool, right? It is neither good nor bad. It's what we do with it that really matters. You know, it can become a barrier if you use it the wrong way. So how do you use it to drive collaboration, engagement, break down barriers? And that's really what we're about, is what processes can we put in place? How can we bring people to the table? How can we ensure that there's creative as well as technological sort of geeks and so on, you know, at the same table, so that you're getting real innovation. And you can use intellectual property as a driver of that and as a tool to drive that kind of collaboration. Because it's only through doing that, bringing that kind of diversity to the table, that I think you get real disruptive innovation. I think we've been reasonably successful. It's a journey. We're on the journey. There's a lot still to be done, but over the past few years, we've really expanded our ability to do this. We're about 3rd in the nation now in terms of startup creation. We're one of the top in terms of industry research occurring on our campus, etc. So, you know, it's an interesting discussion of how to use IP to do that. And data is a big part of that. Data is not IP for the most part, you know, and you have to find this balance between access versus protection. You know, giving access to these data sets to allow people to be innovative and to create applications to the benefit of society on top of that. So how do you create that balance of access versus protection is pretty important. But the last thing I just wanted to mention is this idea of inclusivity and diversity. You know, if you look as a global community, we are failing miserably in that in terms of intellectual property. In the States, only about 16% of inventors are women, and yet there's more women than men in the country. Fewer than 3% of inventors, you know, at the PTO, registered at the PTO, are Black. So how can we possibly maintain competitiveness in a situation where we're leaving out most of society in terms of intellectual property? So we have to do a much, much better job of being inclusive, of you know, helping people to understand that they can contribute to this IP world that we are currently in as well, and you know, showing them stories that resonate with them so that they will actually participate. So that's I think another part of this whole IP story.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for highlighting the fundamental need of including people into the knowledge economy, to the innovation economy. And the question that I want to leave for you is, how can we do that? But we'll have time to talk about it. Claudio, it's a pleasure to have you here. As Chad said, we've been working and doing things together over the years. And now you lead the Brazilian government intellectual property organization. And I see, probably the way I see, you have like 2 challenges that are combined. dealing with the existing situations and questions and how to improve the performance of the whole intellectual property system in Brazil, but also thinking about the future and building future frameworks. So what's your take on this whole situation, Claudio?
Okay. Roberto and Chad, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this group of people who are thinking the future. As you know, I have been invited by Minister Paulo Guedes and President Bolsonaro to lead the Intellectual Property Office of Brazil. And it has become a great challenge from the very beginning, not only for the need of solving problems with the traditional role of an IP office, but also for the challenge of devising the new roles that this institution must play in a knowledge society. And the grasping of this new role falls exactly into the arena of the debate that you're proposing to us. How to lever the use of intellectual property for the purpose of creating innovation, for the purpose of inclusiveness, of creating partnerships that will shape the future of our societies. That's a very important and new questions that most IP offices are asking themselves. What is the intellectual property office of the future? What will it handle, and how it will define its role? First of all, I believe that intellectual property is indeed an entity in itself. I wouldn't call it a tool. It's been with us at least for 220 years. The first patent in Brazil, for instance, was deposited in 1822. That is 200 years ago. It was a coffee bean skinning machine that two French gentlemen deposited. Well, we also look at numbers nowadays and say, look, 90% of the value of the corporations in the S&P 500 are now comprised by intellectual property. I would say that we probably are missing the fact that we are now being able to measure that intellectual property. I cannot believe that those people who started with the oil industry, with the transportation industry in the early 20th century, those people who were involved with car manufacturing and design, with aircraft manufacturing and design, with telecommunications, with let's say, digital equipment, did not have a great value attached to intellectual property. It was the fact that we could not exactly measure in those days that didn't make that show up in the balance sheets. Even the accounting profession in the past 20 years has improved a lot. This has been so important that the Singaporean government, in its 2030 strategy plan, has decided to finance and even assure the value of intellectual property of companies going public in the stock exchange. this is an interesting public policy. Now, why are we looking so differently at intellectual property right now? Because we have moved into a new type of asset in the economy. Intangibles are valuable, and the techniques of valuing, the knowledge of valuing intangibles has become increasingly widespread. On the other hand, the very institution of intellectual property is a major element in incentivizing the flow of knowledge from the inventor to the marketplace, where it can be exchanged, it can be traded, it can be used in partnerships, in companies, to make sense of what is being created. So this is the important issue we face now. How can our offices make sure that we work efficiently, that we work with high quality, with legal assurance that that value exists, is adequately registered, so that it can be transferred by commercialization or by some type of licensing to other parties who can make profit, who can make entrepreneurial activity out of that type of asset. This is the purpose of an intellectual property nowadays.
Thank you, Claudio. So we are not just living in a world full of data that has a lot related to how we are creating things, but now you have highlighted this thing, we can measure things that we could not measure in the past. So thanks for bringing that perspective. We'll be back to you. So closing this round, Chad, I really wanted to turn back to you for your comments and reflections on what we have just heard from our colleagues here.
Thanks, Roberto. Well, maybe I'll just start at the end. I'm intrigued, Claudio, by your articulation of the IP Office of the Future and this idea of better understanding the metrics around that. And it actually, Chris, maybe it reminds me of a conversation we had a few weeks ago where you, Christopher, described in a separate context, along with other colleagues, the incredible transformation around metrics and enterprise and ESG and all of the work around corporate social responsibility, environmental stewardship, and I wonder if there are lessons to learn in both of these exercises that would inform how we think about metrics of the future for IP. So I don't know if Christopher or others have any reactions, or Roberto, to that, or Claudio, but I'd be intrigued to see if because Christopher, you also raised the point around the non-traditional thinking that you at Lockheed Martin have around IP and its relationship to some of the other goals that the company has, and your industry has.
Yeah,
Please,
sure.
over to you.
I'll jump in first on that. So it's a good point. You know, I'm in a bit of a unique role at Lockheed Martin in that I lead both enterprise risk management and sustainability. And I don't want that to seem like sustainability is only about risk. We all know there's a lot of opportunities with it as well. I think intellectual property is a place where both of those aspects come to the fore. So there are risks related to intellectual property and how we use it in the future and how these systems come about, right? Data isn't unlimited, it's big. It seems unlimited, but it's not. And how we use it is what's actually unlimited. So it has to be husbanded because it does actually take resources to develop, store, and use data. It seems invisible to the average person, right? You look at the cloud or the web, and it feels like it's free, but it's really not. And so using that data is something we in our industry, because we've probably dealt with this actually longer than most people in the aerospace and defense world, is something we actually have to think about and be prudent. And so that's why data stewardship is something I mentioned. And that's really using that data wisely, keeping it for the long, archiving it and understanding not just now, but for future generations, how they're going to use that data. And then turn to the unlimited aspect of its use to develop real solutions for people. As was said here, it's not about the data itself. That doesn't make IP. It's about the solutions that can be made.
Data has a cost. Thanks for highlighting that. It's not for free. Yeah. So, Claudio, over to you. Any reflections on what Chris said and the question that Chad posed?
Well, indeed, handling, storing, mining data are the essence of our trade in an IP office. However, you ask the question, what is that data used for? Okay, well, number one, the new IP office has to provide targeted intellectual property awareness in educational programs. So that's using our data systems, our patent repositories, our trademark data banks, and using that in order to identify what we call here the radar of technologies and in their pathways. We have a research area at INPI that deals exactly with this, and it has been extremely useful during the pandemic because we needed to identify what is coming from research institutions in terms of research, patenting, and the direction of future research in treating for the treatment of the pandemic problem. We have to support research and innovation ecosystems. Now, from the very creation phase, and I believe Professor Paul Robin is certainly could extend on that area. From the very start of the creative phase during the let's say the creation of doctoral dissertations and advanced laboratory practices, in order to transform that into a patent deposit, that is a complicated process in itself. Here in Brazil, we are now putting an enormous emphasis in this part of the process, because the initial step is to have a dissertation and publish that dissertation in an academic journal. Now, if that is done this way, it cannot be patented. So we are introducing a provisional deposit of a patent that will allow the researcher to have enough time in order to request a patent deposit. Now, we have, as our office, to identify clearly the ownership of intellectual property rights in order to ensure transparency, trustworthiness in the marketplace, because that's the asset that can be traded or licensed. Again, this has to do with data systems and data science that we use in the intellectual property office. We have to support the commercialization of intellectual property rights. Now, and how do we do that? Through the deployment of trading platforms, creating awareness on intellectual property valuation, which of course is not done by the office, but is taken up by by private parties. That's the essence of a market system, okay? The establishment of values and therefore trading prices. So the idea here is that when we talk about intellectual property, it is not only the law itself that goes in conjunction with antitrust protection, because in any system we provide a temporary period of exclusiveness that people call monopoly, and monopoly is not about that. So we have to balance the benefits to society of giving that a temporary exclusiveness, okay, with the distortion it creates in a competitive market system. So that is the entire spectrum of intellectual property in the world today, and nations have to be aware of that and translate that into their institutional intellectual property systems.
I'll be back to you in a few minutes about the how. What are the new things that you are doing in this scenario? How are you implementing and solving the challenge that you have highlighted? But I also want to take the opportunity and invite everybody to share questions. We already have some questions here. We will be addressing those in a minute. But Paul, I want to turn back to you and maybe explore two things. One is, how do you steer your intellectual property in order to maximize impact? What's the secret sauce for that? And back to your previous comment, what's your take on how we could include more people and all groups into this value creation game?
Okay, secret sauce. I wish I had the answer. But, you know, it ultimately comes back to what Claudio was saying, which was metrics. You know, what are you going to measure around intellectual property? And you have to measure outcome and impact, right? You know, IP in and of itself is not outcome. I mean, I can file patents all day long off a university the size of UC San Diego, but unless it's having impact or outcome, then, you know, we're nowhere, right? So this gets into everything. It starts at education. I think somebody said that as well. You know, researchers and professors, students, and so on. We need to educate them in terms of what is intellectual property. How do you access the IP economy? How do you, you know, leverage it to your benefit, et cetera? That's a hugely important part. And again, it gets back to participation. We are woefully bad in terms, I'm talking globally, in terms of having our societies in general participate in the IP economy. And we need to do an awful lot better at that. But then, you know, after that, it's what is the impact? How many products, services, policies, whatever are directly impacting people in our communities? How many jobs are being created? How many companies are being created? All of those things are things that we need to measure. And I think if we get this balance right between accessing data versus protecting the applications that people build off the data and incentivizing them to then develop the products and services off that, you get that balance right, then I think you're going to see the impact that you're looking at. From a university perspective, we look at how many people can access our intellectual property for the purposes of developing those products and services, and how quickly can they do that. So we spend an awful lot of time simplifying things, streamlining things, making things go faster. You know, the chancellor would love to see zero friction, right? It should be possible to go onto the website and hit a button and get the IP, so long as you're actually going to do something with it and not just sit on it. And to that end, you know, we have, for example, we have our equity license for startups. We don't charge any money to startups that come off our institute to take exclusive licenses to the IP. They can do those licenses with us in 24 hours with no cash up front, because they don't have any cash typically at that stage. So, but on the back end, you have to be sure that they actually develop the products and services at it. So it's, the secret sauce is increasing participation, increasing diversity, increasing access, and the speed at which people can access the IP, while at the same time ensuring that everybody gets a fair shake at the end of the day. The participation piece, was that the second piece you asked me? You know, it's about education. It's about celebrating the success of people, not just middle-aged white guys like myself, you know, but celebrating the success of women, Black people, other underrepresented minorities, you know, and really highlighting that to the community. You too can participate in this. And to that end, you know, we have programs like My Startup XX, which is an incubator for companies started by women out of our Rady School of Management. We have our Latinx program, which is an accelerator program for Latinos, Latinas, you know, who are interested in developing their entrepreneurial skills. We work with We the Plug, which is an organization in the community that represents Black people in entrepreneurship in terms of education and participation. We're now working, well, we're hoping we will be working with this Invent Together organization that was started by the AAU, the American Association of Universities, and Qualcomm and others, to highlight this problem of the inequities in the participation of the IP economy at the USPTO and support the USPTO to be able to measure these things, because what you can't measure, you can't change, right? So there's many, many different ways that, that we're looking at this participation issue.
Thank you, Paul. I took notes on 3 things that you mentioned. Outreach, fundamental to have more people included. Zero friction, simplifying everything, and measuring impact. Is that a good synthesis?
That's great. You see, I say too many words and you get it all down in one sentence. It's great.
So thank you for that. And I'll be back to you. I know that you have ideas and comments, but beyond that and reflecting on what we've heard, you've been working also as a designer of IP systems in some way. I understand the role that you're playing in Ukraine, for instance, helping to set up, let's say, an IP court. So what are your comments and reflections? What do we have heard here?
Right. So, I mean, when it comes to IP and you work on a national level, your ability to redesign things from the start is quite limited, because this is an area which is fairly harmonized on an international level. There's only so much that you can do in tweaking your own national system. In relation to that, there are two I think interesting observations that I would make here concerning both what Paul said and Claudio said. For example, Paul mentioned that there is no IP in data per se, by and large, and that is of course correct. But this is where it becomes interesting for my side. IP arrangements can either, or the IP scaffolding of IP law as it stands, can either encourage the sharing of IP or can actually do the opposite. Now, in the end of the day, most of us, if not all of us, wish well, but there's also a human nature that we need to take into account. And if there is a tool out there that IP as a tool out there may impact, and the shape of it may impact the things that people are likely to do with such a tool. So, for example, and here I'm connecting to what Christopher was mentioning in relation to data and the sharing of data. The scaffolding today of our patent system does not encourage the sharing, the type of data sharing that drives growth in AI systems. Actually, quite the opposite. So keep the data sets that you fed your AI system with, keep it as a trade secret, and you basically lessen the chances that somebody would be able to challenge successfully your patent on the basis of, for example, lack of obviousness. Yes, IP is no data, but the way we shape our IP systems does have an impact on whether we are likely to share or less likely to share data. And the second observation that I had relates to what Claudio was mentioning. And I think IP valuation is on a in general terms is key. A lot of IP is locked into firms' R&D operations, and the ability actually to raise finance on the basis of such IP is at present quite limited. There is reluctance and also lack of understanding, to a large extent, by lenders I mean, it's not a secret that lack of global standards to IP valuation is a problem in that sense. So one of the ways that in which we can actually move forward is drive towards that, the establishment of global standards to the extent possible of IP valuation that would enable companies, especially SMEs, to unlock some of the value that sits there, right, during development stages, and on the back of it, for example, as a collateral, to raise funding that can fund again research and develop, further research and development.
So you are making the case for new and more sophisticated market frameworks in some way.
Yes.
Is that correct? Okay.
Correct.
Yeah. To unleash this potential. So Gulay, I wanted to transition to you and to maybe to shift slide in the conversation here. You comment about involving the user, having the user in the loop, right? So if maybe you could elaborate on how that works in practice and designing for when you have dozens, maybe hundreds of people participating, and how do you see the incentive systems to create these new things, and where does the user sit, in terms of having rights or not? And so over to you, Gulay.
I mean, we all know that the competition is high, and also the failure rate among the startups is also quite high. I mean, so when we look at the reasons, the main reason is they actually don't address any real needs or problems. So to be able to understand the problems and needs, of course, from design perspective, you do context research, get data, define the problem. But as you said, you need to keep user in the loop to make proper iterations and then change your product services accordingly. That this way you really make sure that you really addressing a real need. And in our case, we use the co-creation both involving older people in 9 countries in 2 stages. In the first stage, initially to get the data, it was more about the semi-structured interviews. This is about in the beginning of design thinking, you gather this data, then we synthesize this data, and we came up with these 6 design principles. So even if you are designing a policy for older people, or if you are even designing an IP systems for let's say for older people, still you need to consider all the 6 design principles. This is what these constraints means. Then based on these constraints, as I mentioned, we had 3 products: a footwear, a garment, and a sofa. So we basically had 3 product design teams in almost 4 countries: is UK, Slovenia, Italy, and Spain. So they come up with some initial ideas, and then with these initial ideas, we again brought these initial ideas about these products to these nine countries, to older people, and we had co-creation workshops. In this workshop is basically we ask like which products they prefer and also which features, and we modify together. We prepare tools, canvases for them, and then they become the designer of the workshop. So at the end, we then brought these ideas, we then prototyped, and the technology people indeed edit this smart textile and all this electronics and made the products smart. So when it comes to the IP discussions, your question is very critical, because it's not only in our project, there are a lot of open innovation platforms where end users actively involving and giving ideas, feedbacks. In of discussions, the rights of end user, whether end users should part of the IP rights, is not a discussion currently. Mostly these IPs belong to brands who organize these open innovation challenges, and also most of them you sign a disclaimer. in our case, I mean, we also didn't discuss the end user perspective, but all the 20 organizations have IP rights on these products. Of course, specific sections, technologies belong to some specific partners. But as I in the beginning, as I said, initially the design were more star designer-driven culture, but now everything goes towards more team efforts, more collaborative creative perspective, more collaborative efforts. So that's why either one way or another, at one point, and now we are even talking about the IP, the AI. At one point, this whole IP structure needs to be updated accordingly for this new way of working.
So when we have more people being part of the effort, so you're saying that we need new frameworks in some way. So thanks for highlighting that.
I mean, this currently even the IP experts are not really ready for that. There should be, of course, completely new frameworks.
Okay, so thanks for highlighting that. Maybe what we could do here, we have several questions that are related to things that we talked. We have Mike Nelson talking about IP trolls and the balance, how really patent trolls. So maybe if someone wants to take that question, so how can you help innovators in that context and not just block innovation? And Mike has also shared something here on the chat. We have Stephen commenting about really who takes an ownership when you have a derivation of IP, if I am understanding well that, right? How IP registration is challenging in certain countries. So maybe if there are any comments related to that, and that's more related to the university context. So if anyone wants to comment on those things, but also maybe Vanessa and Simone, if we could share here on the chat the link for the situation paper that we created. Maybe this is a resource that could be interesting for this conversation. So just want to check. Yes, Chad, please.
Could I just also flag something for the panelists to consider? I found a really interesting comment in the chat from Keenan Jarbo. You know, he wants to remind us, I think correctly, that intangible assets are, and I'm just quoting him, are more than IP and the utilization of IP, but it also has to think about worker skills and organizational capabilities. And it struck me because as we've been discussing in other contexts in the Framing the Future series, the deep transformations that companies and firms and organizations are undergoing in the COVID-19 economy are challenging. But we also know that we're facing incredible workforce issues, workforce shortages, workforce transitions. And so if they are key and core to this intangible economy, what does that mean? How do we need to be thinking about the future of our fellow workers and how they engage in this space? So I thought it was another good dimension to bring into the conversation, and would love to hear from our panelists on that more human resource, human capital concept.
Thank you, Chad. I think that one connection that I see here, this context of it's being more than IP, right? It connects a bit with things that Gulay has highlighted. But Chris, I think that you wanted to share something. I want to turn to you.
Sure. There's a lot of questions just came out. I would point out, partially to I think what Chad was saying, that having open source development is one way that you can help. Sometimes I find with the HR challenges, rather than having everything locked down in a particular method. So as an example, the Ingenuity helicopter on Mars, many of you are probably familiar with it. took a ride on the Perseverance rover, what you may not realize is it also is running open source software. It runs Linux, so Linux now has 100% of market share on Mars, which is nice to know. And it also runs open source flight software, F Prime, that you can hack your own helicopter in your own backyard and use the same software as the Mars helicopter. And so that's kind of an example of think about what the cost was there, this speed to market of what they were able to do when they were told, hey, you can put a helicopter on Mars, but you only have this much time to develop it, NASA JPL. Okay, let's use what we have. Let's use open source. I think that's a good example for people who are stretched, for people, startups have been mentioned. And open source is a social reaction to an IP problem.
What's the secret, maybe, Chris, or how do you find the balance between what's open and what's closed? What's the rule? Would you have any advice on that?
Well, I can certainly start off, but looking to other panelists to help me out with that. We work closely with our customer. So for us, a lot of it becomes a government purpose, rights or not, who has ownership of things. So I think you have to look at who you're solving a problem for. If you're a commercial company and it makes sense to trade secret your soft drink, and you're going to use it for hundreds of years, then that might probably make sense. But if you're going to use your data to solve a more temporary solution or something where it's going to benefit a lot more people when it's open, and that probably makes sense. So I think you always have to look at your customer and then walk back from that to see how you're creating the most value.
Chris, would you allow me a question to you? I am curious about what you just described, and I have the following question. Where and when does the USPTO come into consideration?
Where does what come into consideration?
Yes. When you're serving the client in this issue of what is secret and what is open, where does the USPTO come into consideration? When you actually, start proposing or depositing knowledge and trying to get your intellectual property protected.
Yeah, well, again, I think it comes to the value you find. So sometimes you could patent something, but you choose not to because it's not worth the effort, right? As Paul mentioned, universities, could create a lot. I think it was mentioned in the beginning. Lockheed Martin has thousands of patents. We could probably have tens of thousands if we thought that it would be valuable to do so. But in many cases, and we're a bit unique because we primarily have one customer. If that's something that only that customer is going to use, then you have to take that into consideration. And maybe you want to limit where you get the value. So we sometimes spin out things where we maintain the government use rights, but if we just locked it up and said we're only going to use this in aerospace and defense, then the commercial aspect of it would be wasted. And so I think you have to look at that. Now, of course, you want some value out of that, but you do need to open it up to a degree so an ecosystem can come about. And maybe it's the opposite for commercial companies. Maybe they're getting all the commercial value out of a network effect or something, but they're not interested in going to that government side or some other aspect that they're just not interested in that business. Well, let's unlock that IP. So I think that's where you look at it and say, I don't have to create all that value, but let's let someone do it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I
want to turn. Oh, sorry, Claudio.
No, or you could keep it as a trade secret, right? As a protected trade secret.
Yep. Noah, I want to turn to you because I think that sure you have comments about this. How do we use IP? And that's connected to the troll question that we also got here.
Thank you. But before I do that, with your permission, Roberto, just a short observation as to So the question is, what do we keep open? What do we keep closed? And I think Chris was alluding to, it has to make sense to you from a business perspective to open or to close, rather than anything else. And as an example that I sometimes use, and it's true that, I mean, open source, 80% of all code written today is written in open source. It's definitely prevalent. And there are a lot of companies, very large companies. I mean, for example, IBM is I know for a fact is contributing a huge amount of code every year as an open source, but it makes business sense for them. It fits their business model, and their business models, when this kind of thing works, right? So you don't have you have no problem, such as Linux, to share and to contribute to the core, because you charge for the frills, you charge for the add-ons. So the more the core is popular, the better it is for you. Broadly speaking. So we can think about it in that sense. Sometimes it can be useful. But going now to the troll issue, it is indeed more prevalent in some jurisdictions than others, and it has to do with some things that may be considered as boring by some of our participants, but the tweaking of your IP system to such an extent that would make it less likely that such a troll or threats by trolls would prove would basically badger you into basically just paying the royalties, as a nuisance fee and getting over with it. For example, the type of rules that you have locally on remedies such as an injunction. I mean, how easy it is to obtain an injunction, because as an SME, if you get a threat as to an injunction, that means putting you out of business. But if you know that even if someone takes you to court, and even if they are successful, an injunction is not likely to be the end result. But for example, you may be forced to pay a certain amount of damages that represent the extent to which that you borrowed from the person who is now threatening you. That changes the picture. That has less of a chilling effect. Such a letter that you may get one day from a patent troll. Also, there are certain remedies or set of remedies in relation to issues such as threatening letters, right? In certain jurisdictions, should you write a threatening letter to a party and that would prove to be unsubstantiated, you would pay, and you would pay dearly. But that does not exist throughout all jurisdictions around the world. So there are certain things that we can do, tweak our IP systems and a penumbra around our IP system to make such threats having less of a chilling effect, in short.
Thank you, Noam, and for bringing this, let's say, system-wide design perspective, right? But also highlighting the importance of the deep understanding business models. There's a feat related here. As we are approaching the end of our session, there's one thing that we have here that's a quick poll. So maybe we could put that poll on, and it really is about some of the key things or the top challenges that we have for IP systems. And we invite everybody here on the session in attendance to select one of those things, and then we can have a conversation. So please vote, and let's see what comes up. That will provide some food for thought. And thank you, Chris, and thank you, Lockheed Martin, for inspiring this this conversation and the poll here too. Maybe we have, how long do we have, Vanessa, to close the poll?
10 seconds. People are still
10
voting.
seconds. Counting down.
A little more. 4, 3. Let's go.
Chad Evans would vote cyber attacks. We cannot vote. Panelists cannot vote. So let's see what comes up. What are the results? So cyber attacks and speed of technology change, probably the two things that people want to in this session have highlighted as critical issues to be addressed when we think about the future design of IP systems. Maybe we could go for a final, quasi-final round. And what I wanted to do is maybe to invite each one of you to come up with a recommendation about the future. If we think about better engineering IP systems in order to be more inclusive, as we have talked, in order to create more impact, create more value for society, to address the issues related to sustainability, as Chad Evans has stressed in the beginning, sustainability and resilience in the beginning of our session. What would your recommendation be? And maybe I could start with you, Paul. Don't want to put you on the spot, but.
I knew you were going to start with me. Let's see, thinking on the fly here. Well, a couple of things. I mean, one, I think we need to educate society as a whole what this IP stuff is all about. We have to, yeah, I mean, there has to be, I think, you know, I'm speaking for the States here, the US. I think the government needs to take this seriously and needs to put some resources behind educating people. We need to have far greater participation from our society in intellectual property if we're going to stay competitive. Two, I think we have to resource our USPTO to measure these things, measure inclusiveness, measure impact, because really right now we're flying blind in some ways in terms of what the real impact is. If you're not measuring it, then how can we get this balance right between access to data and you know, protection of stuff? And we do have to tackle this AI thing. I don't see the AI as being a huge problem, frankly. I mean, I'm happy if there's an AI inventor on a patent. It's more about, you know, who can practice exclusivity, who do you go to if you're somebody else who wants to access it and so on. But it's inevitable, it's coming. And I think rather than policy being 10 years behind technology, maybe for a change, we should sort of parallel track the two.
Thank you, Paul. And Paul, just want to invite you. We have a question on the chat, actually in the Q&A, that I understand was directed to you. Maybe if you could check that. It's really about ownership and inventorship in the university context. But thanks for sharing those ideas. Claudio, is that you?
May I ask you to give me the word? You have, can I speak?
Sure.
Okay. You have mentioned that you would like to have some practical ideas on what we have implemented in terms, and I would like to take the issues of partnership and co-creation, okay? There exists in the intellectual, in the worldwide intellectual property system, what we call a patent prosecution highway. It is, it could be either global or bilateral. Essentially, we get into a partnership with a certain office, as we have, for instance, with the United States, with Singapore, with the European Patent Office, in order to examine very quickly patents that are granted by these offices and have them validated after, of course, technical analysis by our teams in our country. And that's either a bilateral or a multilateral arrangement. I was never too happy with this system when I first started here. So I proposed to one of our partners, Denmark, that we establish a different type of program. For one thing, countries that are most advanced in terms of intellectual property, patenting, innovation, and scientific development would have an advantage in terms of registering their intellectual property in Brazil, whereas this trade balance would be unbalanced for some time. And I think this is very important for all emerging markets in all developing countries. or middle income developing countries. So what I proposed to our Danish partner was the following. Let's establish some areas, and we took agricultural and agribusiness, we took health, and we took clean energy. And let's make an effort of putting our research institutions, our most advanced companies in each of these areas, to start collaborating on research and development in order to achieve joint patenting of creations that were done together. What I can tell you that we started with agriculture. It was very important for Brazil, very important for Denmark. They have intellectual property. We have both intellectual property and areas to be cultivated here. And you cannot believe the success of this initiative. It has run for a whole year. We have set up webinars with major research centers in Brazil, involving companies and partners in research and development from both sides. And believe me, after 1 year, we are now next month having a boot camp at an agricultural trade show, the major agricultural trade show. And we have been able to make 65 partnerships in research, in licensing of technologies, and trade among the countries. And we are starting the health issues now. So I believe that this type of initiative is something that an IPO office, we did that with the embassy. I did, of course, having our partner IPO office involved, and it has been extremely successful. So I can see that we could have a worldwide partnership for joint development and co-ownership of intellectual property going on. That's a very important Brazilian experience that I would like to share with the audience and my fellow panelists.
Thank you so much. Great case and great idea. What comes to my mind always is, why do we need to patent in each country individually? Why don't we have a one-stop shop that would, let's say, facilitate this process? But
we do have the WIPO organization, the World Intellectual Property Organization, has set platforms, specific platforms for patents, and you can deposit and have that patent recognized in 120 countries. We have recently joined the so-called Madrid system for trademarks. We are now joining the Hague system for industrial design. So that already exists, okay? Because first of all, the granting of patents is an issue of national sovereignty. So you have one platform, but each country attached to that platform will make the granting according to its own rules.
Thank you, Claudia, for sharing that and for sharing ideas about the future of future design of IP systems. Gulay, I would turn to you for final remarks with this thing. What would be your recommendation on the future design of IP systems, how we create, let's say, new things and we appropriate the value?
Of course, I'll have my let's say suggestions from design point of view and very practical points indeed. First of all, I mean, I think using service design to design the IP systems would be quite practical, smart, and it would make it really accessible, easy to use. So right now, if it's not accessible because it's quite complicated, I mean, it kind of scares people to even start the application. So service design can solve all these issues. And second, the team who design these systems should be multidisciplinary. I believe it would bring really different perspectives to the whole design. And the third, there should be some creative people part of it, because creativity, this open innovation, co-creation perspectives are going to be widely used. And then this type of perspectives are really needed when you design the systems. So that's why I highly recommend to have people who indeed have went through this type of practices are part of teams who design these systems.
Bringing a design perspective to design IP systems and having different perspectives reflect on that. So thank you, Gulay. Noan, over to you. Your recommendations for the design of future IP systems. You are muted.
My apologies. I would actually my previous panelist Gulay and the area of design. Now we mentioned earlier FOSS-free and open source software, and this arrangement. By the way, this is not anti-IP. This is using IP in order to mitigate some of the potential consequences of IP. We have seen, but that is purely in relation to code. We have seen, in spirit at least, broadly speaking, something not dissimilar happening in relation to Creative Commons and copyrighted works, right? The ability of engaging with fellow creators and sharing. And again, it has to do with your business model. You know, if it makes sense to you, you would offer your work to be shared under certain circumstances in relation to certain restrictions. So, for example, in relation to Creative Commons, I guess that we, in terms of recommendation, what we can do such initiatives is encourage its greater use to the extent possible, but also think a bit further away. For example, at least in principle, I do not see why we cannot encourage the initiation or the creation of a similar platform in relation to industrial designs. There are various contexts in which sharing your design or aspects of your design can make sense to you as a business, although you are not getting royalty right there and then. Yeah, we can think about those things creatively. And for that, as Gulay has mentioned, having creators, people in the creative industries as part of the process would be essential. Because we have to understand how that process actually works in order to design, say, families of licenses that would fit such a sector or sectors.
So you are making the case for a more diverse IP system, right? In both sense, in terms of stakeholders,
licensing platforms. Correct. Yes.
Yep. Okay. Thank you for that, Noan. Chris, over to you. What's your design recommendation for the future?
Well, I want to reiterate data stewardship and governance drives useful IP creation. It takes integrity and provenance of it. As AI becomes ever more important, it's reliant on data. And we have to understand that there could be embedded biases, there could be malicious actors. So to truly create valuable IP, the entire process, whether it's AI or not, must be kept ethical, verifiable, and sustainable.
So one very question, I don't know, there's not a precise or exact answer. In terms of maturity levels, Chris, how do you see our readiness with industry, academia, let's say business leaders, in terms of understanding the importance of data and stewarding data today from 0 to 10? Where are we in terms of being ready to deal with this emerging reality?
Well, I'll be optimistic and give us an 8.5. How about that? I think that, just from who we have on this panel, you'll see that between government regulation, between all parts of society, all types of organizations, profit, nonprofit, university, there's an understanding of this, and there's a desire for partnership, right? Everyone used that word at some point. So if we all partner on what is this unlimited resource, then that's just going to help everyone.
Thank you so much, Chris. Chad, over to you.
I only want to thank the panelists. I have no final comment. I saw Paul had his hand raised. I'm willing to defer to Paul, and I will just thank everyone for participating today.
I just had one crazy idea. What about a block grant system to subsidize access to attorneys for those who don't have the means to do it?
I would say, an innovative idea. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. Okay. So a few things before we finish. Really, thank you so much for bringing this different perspectives. I leave this session with 3 ideas in mind. One is diversity, really in terms of diversity of IP systems, bringing new voices into the conversation. The second one, it's about data. So that there's a potential there. We can create new markets, but we need to enhance and train people and prepare them to really to deal with this emerging reality. And the third thing, it really is about this combination of people and machine, people and technology that we're all trying to make sense. So thank you for bringing your perspectives. There's one GFCC tradition. We always take a picture from people here. So please open your cameras. We're taking a picture for all of you who have joined us here today. And thank you. Yeah, it was a pleasure to have you. We are continuing this conversation. The GFCC Frame the Future series will continue until December the 1st and the 2nd, when we'll have the GFCC Global Innovation Summit. The IP session was made possible because of the engagement and support of Lockheed Martin Corporation. So thank you so much for your thought leadership and your engagement with us, and all of you for joining us. In addition to the 11 Frame the Future sessions, we will have in August 2 special conversations. One, it's coming up next week, and it's about technology and universities. It'll be on the 5th, a different time, so please stay tuned. And on the 18th, we're having a conversation about future universities. So please sign up for GFCC social media, join us on YouTube to recap our previous sessions, register for the GFCC Frame the Future conversation series, tweet about us using the Frame the Future hashtag. It was a pleasure to have you all here. We invite you to continue the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.